Hello, you are live, it tells me. Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Testers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very many reasons. And today is a little unusual because I am streaming from my home in the guest bedroom uh, because there's a wonderfully terrible snowstorm going on outside in Chicagoland, and I'm working from home today. So I got the fun, noise isolating headphones, and here we are. But just, I guess, figured I wanted to point out, yes, it's a different location and different background. But same deal, what we do most weeks. And obviously last week was a little different and the week before was a little different. But this is the This Is Not Therapy Hour, which is just an open conversation, Q&A, however you want to look at it. I'm here to talk about some stuff just so that we make it easier for everybody to get going instead of just sitting silently and waiting and staring at anybody who joins in until you tell me something you want to talk about. But that topic doesn't really matter. It's just something I thought might be interesting. What we're really focused on here is whatever it is that you guys are wanting to talk about, whatever your questions you have or situations you might like some support with, please feel free to put it in chat. Everything you say, it's a conversation. What you say guides my responses, and what I say guides your responses, and we're just doing this together. So I know there's always a lot of people who watch but don't log into chat. Not everybody's comfortable with that, and that's great. If you are, please, it's fun for me and helpful for me to have people be as active as possible. Otherwise, sometimes it starts to just kind of feel like I'm talking out into the void, which is not the worst thing, but less fun than talking with actual people. Keep in mind that this is a live stream that anyone can join, access, watch now or later. So be aware of that with whatever you're putting in chat. I try not to call people's names out, just mention the comments, but it's not private, so don't say things that you wouldn't say or that you would only say in private. Cecil's producing. This is normally where I would say, Cecil, did I get everything? But I think I did. I think I covered all the important stuff. Oh, Effective Artistry, that logo in the corner there. That's I started and run a therapy and coaching practice called Effective Artistry. We do therapy, we do executive functioning coaching, we do all kinds of interesting and fun stuff, including some new things that we're going to be getting into soon around corporate consulting, which, I don't know. Anyway, today, to start us off, until and unless I have people putting things in the chat that takes us in a different direction, I thought it might be a good week to talk about something, well, limits and boundaries, things that I think are important, obviously, but generally we think are important. I think most of us think that some version of those things are important. And as always, I just want to add new language, add new frameworks, additional options for how people can view these things, approach these things, so that in case it's something that you have been struggling with or needed help with, maybe these new options will be helpful for you. As always, this is not a competition. It's not ever about saying other ways of doing this and approaching this are bad and this is the right way. Different things work for different people. Remember, what we care about here is utility, not accuracy. That there are many different ways to accurately talk about, define, describe anything. And the accuracy of any of those ways doesn't detract from the accuracy of any of the others. So we can just explore many different accurate ways of looking at a thing until we find useful ones. And once we find useful ones, we're mostly going to be done exploring it, because why would we continue if we don't need anything there, right? So limits and boundaries today is where we're starting. And there's reason for that, and I'm sure we'll get into it all. But I wanted to start with this concept that I find very helpful for myself and for clients. And is it crossing a boundary to suggest that you look like therapy? Jesus. No. I don't know, maybe for somebody else, but not for me. That's my father that put that comment in there. Thank you, Dad. Yeah, the hair's getting a little long. It was intended to get a haircut a while back, and then Omicron happened, and I have 3 young children, but 2 of whom are under 5 and are not vaccinated, so we're being very cautious. But the shoulder length hair probably won't stick around forever. Um, so this concept that I find helpful that I want to help, put out there is that there are two different kinds. So when I'm talking about limits, I guess I should start there. We're talking about limits of a person's ability or capability to do a thing, right? That I have my limits. I can do what I can do, and there are limits to what I can do. But there are two different kinds of limits, and I think it's important to kind of put that out there because otherwise people get them confused. And we have a lot more experience with the first, which is soft limits, than we do with the second, which is hard limits. And people tend to respond to hard limits as though they're soft limits, and that's a real big problem. So let me define those terms. Within my limits, my soft limits, right? Within my limits, I can do anything I want. It's sustainable. What I'm doing is sustainable. What I'm getting out of every day is roughly equivalent or even more than what I'm expending, putting into every day. So that every day, I'm not in a worse place tomorrow than I am today. That's sustainable and I can do it indefinitely. As long as that is true, I'm within my limits. The soft limits are when I start to do anything that becomes unsustainable, even if it's only slightly. Even if it's only that I'm going to be in a slightly worse place tomorrow than I am today, or a slightly worse place an hour from now or a moment from now than I am right now, that's when I'm crossing those limits. That's the definition of it for me, is crossing your soft limits is when you are entering into things that are unsustainable. And I'll just define hard limits right off the top, and then we'll talk about both. Hard limits are limits you can't cross. It has nothing to do with sustainability or not. You just can't do it. We are limited. We have limits to our abilities that no matter how badly you want, no matter how much you care, no matter how much you're willing to sacrifice or think, that there is just not a way to get it done. There's just not a solution, not for you in the context that you're in that moment. And I guess real quick, I should reference back to an earlier concept we've talked about because I never know who's here that hasn't been here before and who's seen what, is that capability is not binary, it's fluid. Something that I'm capable of in one context, I might not be capable of in a different context, right? I am capable of singing quite well, I'm told, but probably not while I'm in the middle of a workout and I'm breathing hard, right? So again, people get confused with, I've done this before, why can't I do it right now? What's wrong with me? And assuming that something must have broken in them, that they're stupider than they used to be, that they're weaker than they used to be, whatever. When most often, of course, we do forget how to do things and whatever, but most often, if you could do something before and you can't do it now, it's because of a change in the context. And in particular, one of those changes is that there's just other things taking your resources. This is very applicable both with the topic of limits today, but also just with the way that many, if not most, if not all of everybody's lives are right now. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about capability. It's not a binary. It's not static, right? So soft limits we can push past. It damages us, or at least potentially damages us. We have to pay for it later. It's unsustainable, which means it's basically dipping into our reserves. But those reserves are there for that reason, right? We're able to go past them because sometimes it's necessary or helpful or important to go past those limits. And you just got to know when you do, you're going to pay for it later. And you can only go past those limits for so long before it all collapses. And whether that's burnout or physical collapse or whatever, sooner or later, you collapse. You can't keep going. And that's the one that we tend to focus on, the soft limits, right? Because that's where things like, oh, is it a reason or is it an excuse? Do I really care enough, or I'm just not trying hard enough, or et cetera, get involved. And we argue and debate about these things and should you push on this and whatever. And then hard limits. So as an example, if I were to tell you to go lift a box, right? We have our soft limits. So all of us, whatever the weight of that box or the shape or whatever, where the handles are of that box, there are plenty of boxes we can lift. And then there are plenty of boxes where it approaches a point you bend over and try and grab the box, or you reach down and try and grab the box and lift it. And it's heavy enough that you're like, oh no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Even though you probably could actually lift it. At least there's a window there, right? There's a window between like, no, no, I'm not going to try and lift this on my own. That's a bad idea. And I am physically incapable of lifting this no matter how much I try. And in that window, it's not all the same, right? It gets better and worse, but you might injure yourself, right? That's why we don't want to do it. We're saying, I maybe could, but it is, if I push on this thing, it might hurt me pretty bad. Or it's easier for me to find a different solution than to push that hard on this thing, to go get somebody else to help me, which I didn't want to do, but that's easier than lifting this on my own. But eventually the box gets heavy enough that you just literally cannot lift it. And this is a terrible like thing to have to deal with, to have to come to grips with, because those hard limits are usually associated with very, very bad things, in particular death, right? That at a certain point, there's just nothing else to try. There is, no matter how smart you are and how brave you are and whatever, at a certain point in certain contexts, there's just no ability to keep pushing. But if we treat those hard limits like they're soft limits, like if we just cared enough, we could push past them, then we're going to feel terrible about that. We're going to feel like, because we don't reach those unless everything that we're doing is very important to us, right? That if we hit our soft limits and we're doing a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter, we just stop doing that stuff for as long as necessary until we can start it, pick it back up again, because we don't want to go past the soft limits. But sometimes we do, and we push past. But by the time we do that, push past the soft limits, we've mostly cut, separated the wheat from the chaff. Is that what it is, right? Like we've gotten rid of the things that we are able to get rid of without it causing too much of a problem. So by that point, we're already dealing with all kinds of stuff that's important. And if there's more and more and more, by the time we are approaching our hard limits, there are no easy cuts. Everything is, if I fail at this, that's terrible. I'm terrible. I'm letting this person down. I'm letting that person down. I'm harming myself in this way, or that person, or this group. There's nothing easy to let go of there. So it's already a terrible situation. But then when we think of it as, I could keep pushing, I just don't want to, well, now I'm just being selfish. Now you've hit your limit. I'm hitting this over and over because this is incredibly, incredibly common right now, where we've talked a lot in the past, the context has shifted such that a lot of the things that we're doing, which are more or less the same things that we've been doing before this context existed, but modified or maybe not, so that it's harder to continue to do them. It's not suited to what we're doing. We just keep taking on more and more and more until we hit our limits. I feel like I'm being so abstract and philosophical. I should have said, I always say I have a tendency to go this direction when left by myself. I always want to go more broad because I don't know what's applicable to whom. But if people ask questions, especially, the more specific you get, the more specific I can be and not just ramble on about philosophy all the time. Although hopefully it's helpful anyway. The thing I'm finding particularly relevant about this. So last summer we did one of these where we were talking about getting help, right? Getting support and how important that is. And we came across a question that we separated out into the next week's stream, and we did a whole thing about it, which was, well, what about when you are so depleted that you just don't even have the ability to get the help that you need? How do you do it then? And that's a terrible question, because there's no answer. It's paradoxical. When you have no ability to get help, how do you get help? You don't. You just wait. You survive for as long as you can until and unless, hopefully something changes, something outside of your control changes so that things get better. That's a lot of what the point of being in community is, and being in relationships is. There are times when I got nothing left in the tank and you step up and you help me. And there are times when you've got nothing left in the tank and I step up and I help you. So that we don't need to be the person that when I've got nothing left in the tank, I still have to somehow find a way to ask for help. You can't. And so you're just screwed until something happens, until someone notices and comes along and helps out, or all kinds of other things can change that have nothing to do with you or anybody around you or paying attention to you, and it just so happens to be that it makes it better. Well, right now, there are a lot of relationships, there are a lot of communities where everybody is depleted, where I'm depleted and I need help. But all of you, my friends and family and loved ones that normally would help me when I'm in this place, you're also depleted. So not only can you not help me, but you need help too. And I can't help you. So now we're all stuck waiting, trying to survive for as long as we can in this situation until somebody else comes along or something else changes. There's a reason that so many people want things to be back to normal, whether they are in reality normal or not, whatever that means. There's a reason that there's COVID fatigue and Zoom fatigue, and there's a reason that there's burnout. And as I've seen a few different people make jokes about that, like, yeah, burnout was 6 months ago. I don't know what this is, but it's way past burnout. And it gets even worse, especially common in parent-child relationships or in romantic relationships where, okay, I want you to help me. I want you to notice that I need help and help me without me even having to ask for it, because I can't make myself ask for it right now, right? But you don't, so that bothers me. But then I find out you need help and I can't. So that bothers me because I feel bad because I care about you and I know you need help and I can't give it to you. I feel even worse now. And a lot of times now I'm pissed at you because I have a problem, and my problem is that you're upset, you're sad, you're drained, and I can't fix it. If you just weren't that, then that problem would be off my shoulders. And maybe even if you weren't that, you could help me. And a lot of the time we get stuck in these fights where basically we're trying to convince each other, hey, you know what? I'm the one who has it the worst right now, and you're the one who needs to help me, not vice versa. You're complaining about. But of course, my experience is valid and your experience is valid, and we both are just stuck dealing with the same crap. So when that's the case, it's particularly hard. And the best thing that we can do, to whatever extent we're able, is to just stay on a team. To say, yep, you're right. This sucks that you're dealing with that. And I'm sorry that I can't do more to help with it. And it sucks what I'm dealing with and what we're dealing with together. And it sucks that you can't help. So let's just survive this together as best we can instead of trying to convince the other person that they're supposed to be the one that's helping. We have a question in chat. What's my baseline? Am I happy with that? If not, am I willing to do more, or can I ask someone for help, or can I change what I'm happy with? Yeah, so I don't know if this was an intentional reference to the way that I define problems, but it dovetails with that. We've talked about this, that a problem is I am aware, not just I know or have access to the information, but I am consciously thinking of. I am aware of something that is different than I want it to be, or that I think is going to be different than I would want it to be. And then there's the hidden variable there, that what it is splits into the material conditions of the thing, but also filtered through my perception of those conditions. So if I want to solve the problem, I have 4 variables I can play with. I can go from being aware of it to being unaware of it. I can change the material conditions so that they come more in line with what I want things to be, or I can change my perception of what's happening so that even though nothing has changed, I now see it as something that's closer to what I want it to be, or I can change what I want to try and come more in line with what my perception of what is. And none of those, including the last one, are totally under our control. And that's a particularly problematic one, especially with toxic positivity, that people will say, you're in control of how you react to things. Just choose to be happy, which is, nice and useful to the extent that it's useful, but also limited and obviously not perfect. Why would anyone ever be sad if we had the ability to just be in 100% control of how we feel at all times? Why would anyone ever be angry or anxious? We would always feel ecstatic if we could just do that by willing it to be so. But that doesn't mean that we have no ability to shift things. We have some, right? Not perfect control, and the context matters. Sometimes we have barely any, sometimes we have a lot. So we approach all these things differently. As far as baseline, can you clarify what you mean? What's my baseline? Am I happy with that? Because I know how I would define that, but I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to there. And then willingness. If I'm not happy with what's happening, am I willing to do more, or can I ask for someone for help, or can I change what I'm happy with? Willingness is obviously, again, a useful concept. it's important because there are things that I'm willing to do and things that I am not willing to do. But what it comes down to basically is I'm imagining how something might play out, how I could do X, Y, and Z, and that might result in A, B, and C. And as with all things that I am thinking of, that can be accurate and it cannot be accurate. So there's limits, but that's what we're talking about willing. I'm saying, I think if I did X, Y, and Z, then I would get A, B, and C result. And so now we're asking, do I think that the resources that I would have to expend, the things that I would have to do in order to do A, B, and C, is that worth X, Y, and Z? And if the answer is yes, then I say I'm willing. And if the answer is no, I say I'm not willing, right? So effectively, when we're talking about willingness, we're back to cost and value. I know that sounds like splitting hairs, but to me, it's a big distinction, because when people say willing, I think usually we interpret that or mean that to be a personality thing, right? Like if you wanted to, you could, right? That willing oftentimes is used as a synonym for wanting. You're willing to do it means you want to do it. And that's not true. And I use this same example, and I'm sure I've used it a million times on here, but just as a way of saying, if I say, hey, do you want $1 million? Most people, most of the time, are going to say, yes, I want $1 million. And then I say, great, all you have to do, I'll give you $1 million. All you have to do is give me $2 million first. And then most people are going to say, nope, I'm not willing to give you $2 million in order for me to get $1 million out of it. And so while technically, yes, we could theoretically say, I'm going to convince you to be willing to give me 2 million in order to get 1 million out. But that's only by adjusting the value, right? That I'd have to manipulate things so that in addition to the million you get back, everything else that happens when you give me the $2 million is worth that additional $1 million to you. So it's not like, to me, it's not a character thing. It's at a certain point it makes sense for you, and at a certain point it doesn't, right? Oh, I see. Okay. So willing, it's hard because, especially when we're talking about limits, at soft limits, it matters. Am I willing to potentially damage myself, right? That I'll do this thing even though it seems unsustainable, or even though it seems like there's a risk of injury or burnout or whatever to it. I'm willing to take that risk. But hard limits willingness has nothing to do with it. And that's where we get stuck. We don't ever want to think that about ourselves. We are all the protagonists in our own story for the most part, right? That, yeah, problems and problems and problems, but I always survive them, because that's always true until whatever when you don't. And we're not talking to those people who are not alive right now, right? So yeah, every problem that's ever come my way, I've found a way to survive it. And we then kind of end up thinking I'm able to navigate and solve any problem. But sometimes a problem comes along that you can't. And it's very hard at that point to acknowledge that it's not about willingness, it's about actual limitations. So in clarification to the baseline, I said, what do you mean by baseline? My squat personal record was 7 plates, 7 45-pound plates on each side. Holy cow. Today, my limitation is 1 plate baseline. So I like that. And by that definition, what you're using baseline to mean is what I was saying, being within your limits, right? Because again, baseline, it fluctuates, meaning you could do less than 1 plate. Why is that not baseline? Right? So I think what you're trying to say is baseline is the most I can do before it becomes unsustainable. The most I can do before it becomes risky or dangerous, I'm guessing. And yeah, that's what we're talking about. Context is different. Obviously, there were differences beyond just your personality, your willingness to push yourself, or how much, the want to, right? There were other changes in the context between when you could squat however many that is, 14 45-pound plates, 700-ish. That seems like so much. And when you can only do 100-ish, right? So this is the thing, that everything that we do is the result of an interaction between ourselves, the individual, and the context. And we lose track of that, and we think that only the individual matters, only I matter, which of course sounds ridiculous when I say it that way. You're going to say, oh, that's selfish people and narcissistic people or whatever. Obviously, things matter more than the person. But what about when that causes me a problem, right? Rather than saying only I matter, therefore I can do what I want. Instead, I'm saying only I matter, therefore this terrible thing I'm experiencing is entirely my fault, totally under my control. Same root, but we tend to treat it differently. We respond to it differently. You're not the only thing that matters. You can't just will your way to victory, completion, I don't know, accomplishment, success, whatever word you want to use. It's an element of it. And this is an important one, that we can change the individual. I can change myself, right? I can, in this particular example, I can work and work until my muscles get to a point and my technique gets to a point, and et cetera, that I'm able to do that. Of course, there are other things I can do. I can get the right equipment. This is external to me, right? With the right equipment and the right support and coaching in order to help me learn how to do it with the right, I don't even know, I'm sure that there are right chemicals that I could inject into my body in some way that would enable me to do it. But changing the self, changing the individual, it takes time. It takes repeated effort over time. In other words, if I want to beat my father-in-law in a game of tennis, I'm going to have to practice tennis and all the skills that go back up into, like if we were to theoretically break tennis into all its sub skills, I'm going to have to practice those things over and over and over and over time to get to a point where I can do that. So that's great. We've talked in the past, there are 3 avenues to make change. Once you determine that there's something you want to be different than it is, you can make changes in the self, you can make changes in the context, the environment, or you can make changes in the way that the self and the context interact with one another. And each of those things has different, optimal use cases. I don't know, using like jargony terms, meaning changing the self is the advantage to that is that changes, that change sticks with you regardless of the context. So whatever work I put into making it so that I can lift more weight, well, I can lift more weight, whether it's my weight or somebody else's weights, whether I have the right equipment or not, whether it's a squat or this other particular form, it applies across the board. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and energy to do that. Whereas changing the environment tends to be something that can be simple. It can be, it can be done in a moment, or sometimes it takes more than that, but generally speaking, doesn't take a lot, at least compared to developing skills. But it might not be very helpful outside of the specific environment, the specific context in which you've made that change. That like, if what I'm saying is I want to squat 7 plates, well, if I, this is going to sound like cheating, but that's kind of the point, right? That if I use springs that I hang from the ceiling so that when I get under the weight and bend down, that it actually doesn't actually require that my body exert enough force to do that, because some of that weight is taken off by the springs. But that's not going to help me lift more weight elsewhere. And this example is a bit of a tricky one, because lifting weights is specifically something that we do generally, those who do it, do in order to increase their own capability. So doing something like attaching springs to the ceiling would defeat the purpose of why you're doing it. But let's say that you've been asked to do it, right? That you're being graded on it. Then you find the criteria. Is it just that I need to put this up on my shoulder, bend down, and stand back up? Because then there's lots of loopholes that I can use where I change the environment. In this case, changing the environment probably wouldn't do much. And changing the self mostly is all you're going to be able to do, but you got to do it repeated over and over and over and over. So yeah, baseline shifts over time. What's within your limits shifts over time. Capability is not binary. And if you judge yourself against the version of yourself that was able to do more than you are currently able to do, of course you're going to feel bad about that. I don't know that that's ever really very useful. Yeah, there you go. Different equipment that helps you to engage with the weight in a different way, right? The limit isn't acceptable, but it's a truth I have to accept and find workarounds. I love that because even though it's obviously, you know, self-contradictory, the limit isn't acceptable, but I have to accept it. Here's the thing, it doesn't matter whether you accept it or not. Hard limits, especially. You can accept it, you can avoid accepting it. It doesn't matter. It's a truth independent of your perception of it. There is an actual physical limit to how much weight your body, your muscles can lift. Accept it, deny it, doesn't matter. But what does matter, if you accept it or deny it, is what happens instead. Either way, you're not lifting the weight. But what else happens? Do you push and push and try so hard that you injure yourself? That's a reasonable thing to expect from somebody who's not accepting the reality of the limit. Or do you not even try it at all? That's a reasonable outcome to expect from somebody who does accept the outcome of the limit. Or do you build on and work around things and develop it over time? I'm laughing at the chat again. Which right now is just me and my dad talking to each other, which is kind of fun, with an unknown number of observers monitoring the conversation. Yeah, that's the thing, is accepting your limits gives you the ability to make different choices about how you're approaching it. Not accepting your limits doesn't remove them. It just means that you're going to keep banging up against them until you collapse, until you get hurt. Yeah. So, of course, I always would want people to accept their limits, but that just means understand your limits. Doesn't mean you have to be okay with them. Just means you have to understand and acknowledge the reality of the situation. I hate that I am in a position where my best option is this, because this is still something I don't like. It's something I would never do, except in this circumstance in which it is literally the best option that I have. There's two different things. There's what is, there's what's happening or what's happened or what will happen. And there's how I think about it, how I feel about it. And they're both valid and they're both important, and we should address both. And there's different circumstances where one is more relevant than the other. But no matter what, they're two different things. And we can address one without addressing the other. It's theoretically possible, even though it's not always actually possible, right? Meaning that I can think accurately or not, but let's assume accurately, I can say, this is unfair, it's ridiculous, it's unreasonable, I should not be in this position, I shouldn't have to do this thing, this is that person's responsibility, it shouldn't be on my plate, blah, blah, blah. We can think all that and it can be valid and it can be true, and the thing can still exist and still need to be dealt with. So it's good to be aware of them both, and it's good to be aware that they're separate things. What I want and what I'm doing are different. What I want to have and what I have are different. What I want to do and what I do are different. What I want to think, what I want to feel, and what I actually think and what I actually feel are different. And the want part is good because it lets us aim at, okay, that's what I'm going to try and work toward. But it doesn't change what is happening in the meantime. And if I don't accept that, acknowledge that, whatever terms you want to use, which is why I'm trying to separate soft limits and hard limits from each other. If I don't acknowledge that, then that just means I'm going to behave in a way that would make sense if reality was different than it actually is, right? If I just pretended that I could lift as much as I want, then I'm going to behave in a way that would make sense if that were true. And that way of whatever behavior that might be, can really mess me up if it's not actually true, if it's not accurate, right? We talked about this recently with people saying the news is depressing, I don't pay attention to it in regards to COVID. Great. That makes sense. I understand that. And then you're more likely, if what you're saying is that reality is depressing and I don't want to know about it, then you're more likely to make decisions and go about your life as though reality was not as depressing as it actually is. And some of that's going to be fine, but some of that might cause you problems because you're making decisions based on things that aren't actually true. Again, back to soft limits, hard limits, because we encounter the first ones way more. Honestly, I think most people encounter that almost every day, at least the option of pushing past them, the possibility of pushing past them, even if you don't actually push past them every time. But because that's our experience with limits, I could do it, but it'll hurt. Then we focus back on willingness. Okay, I'm willing to hurt myself for this because it will hurt even more if I don't. But then we hit the hard limit and we think, because that's, we mostly experience soft limits, we think, I could do it if I just was willing to hurt myself even more or expose myself to more risk or whatever. But no, you can't. And if you behave in a way that makes sense as though it were a soft limit when it's actually a hard limit, again, either way, you're not lifting the weight. It's just a matter of whether you control how that happens or not. If you're headed for burnout, if you're headed for shutdown, if you can acknowledge that and understand it, then you have the opportunity to make changes and do things differently or choose. Honestly, what a lot of people are struggling with right now, you just have more on your plate than you are literally capable of doing. Hard limit. But all of it's important. And you don't want to give any of it up because it's all important. If it wasn't, you would have given it up already. Well, then you have two choices. Either you continue to do the thing that is unsustainable because you're already past your soft limits, right? Until you collapse and everything falls apart. Or you cut something out. And yeah, it sucks to give it up. It sucks to fail at it. It sucks to whatever. But that's going to happen anyway a little bit later, just along with everything else that also gets dropped. Don't have to like it. And the really tricky part of that is it's always possible something will change. That if you're like, okay, yes, I can't keep this up much longer, but I'm gonna, because what if tomorrow this magical thing happens? What if in a week this magical thing happens? We see it in movies all the time, right? Like the big damn hero moment. There's a reason I think that we respond to that so much, of somebody who's in a situation that they're clearly going to lose or die unless something changes, but they're still doing everything they can to hang on, keep it going. And then at the last possible minute, the heroes show up and rescue them, right? Where for an hour, it's been clear they're going to lose. So why not just give up at the beginning? Well, because you never know what might change. And that pays off in the movies and in the stories. See, last minute, you can't ever give up any earlier than you absolutely are forced to, because something might show up. It's true, it happens, but it's hard to predict. There's a reason we make narratives out of it, because it's not super common, at least in those kinds of dramatic situations, So yeah, accept it, don't accept it. Either way, you can't do it. Feel good about it, feel bad about it. Either way, you can't do it. And like I said before, we have limited ability to control how we feel about it, to just make ourselves say, throw my hands up in the air, nothing I can do. No. If it was that easy, you would have done it. You're going to feel bad. But you either get to choose the things that falter, the things that fail, and where you feel bad, or you don't. And there's not always an easy answer, but generally speaking, I would always rather be in control of which things I'm going to let drop than trying to keep it all going and then end up dropping a bunch that I didn't intend to drop. Because what if it's the more important ones? They're all important, but some are still more important. So the reason I said limits and boundaries is because I think this stuff relates to the concept everybody talks about all the time of boundaries. And I like boundaries. Obviously, it's important. And boundaries are one of those things, like enabling, like codependency, like helicopter parenting, all these concepts that become very popular that just so happen to justify, give a rational reason for not helping somebody, right? I get it that you want more of my help, but I need to set my boundaries because boundaries are healthy. And it's true. I'm not saying that it's not. It's just interesting to me that the concepts that are usable to justify not helping someone, whether they're accurate or not, become very popular, right? Here's what I think about boundaries. I think I categorize it in two ways. There's proactive and reactive boundaries, because that's what I do. I categorize and I label, and you might be able to make some distinctions and determinations about other things that are true about me and labels that might apply to me based on that. But Proactive versus reactive boundaries. Mostly when people are talking about boundaries, they're talking about what I consider to be reactive boundaries, which means somebody is attempting to get more out of you than you should give, than you are willing to give, than you want to give. It depends on the thing, right? But somebody's asking for more of your time, your attention, your energy, your something. They're asking for more of it than you want to give. And so you say no. That's holding your boundary, right? Setting your boundaries can be in advance, right? I'll give this much and no more. And then as people ask, you give them until you hit the boundary, say, nope, no more. And that's good. But there's a couple inherent flaws with reactive boundaries. One is saying no is not always easy. And depending on where you set those boundaries, by the time you get to the part where you're supposed to be saying no, where you've predetermined this is my boundary and I'm going to say no, you might not have what it takes at that point. You might be depleted enough at that point that you can't even say no. And you're kind of screwed. Even if you do have what it takes to say no, it still takes something. It depletes you, it drains you to just say no. It potentially damages the relationship. And if it doesn't, it might make you worry that it will, even if it doesn't, maybe it does. You know, saying no to people when they want things from you is not easy. It's important, but not easy. So I think it's important to have reactive boundaries and to know how to utilize them. And I think that's all important. But I think even better, the ideal is to have what I call proactive boundaries, which just means that I am setting lower bounds instead of upper bounds on how much I'm willing to help you, how much of my time or money I'm willing to give to somebody, and I say no when it's too much. That I'm setting lower bounds of what I'm spending on the things that I want to do. That I'm going to spend at least X amount of my time, Y amount of my energy on this. And if I do that, if I do enough of that, then all of my resources are going toward the things that I want them to go towards. And I don't have to say no to anybody because they're not going to ask me because I don't have it. You know, if my time is all booked, nobody's going to ask me to help them move or whatever thing I don't know why moving is like the thing that comes up for me with boundaries, but maybe I've been asked to help people move too much. I should explore that maybe. No, if my friend asks me to move and I actually have the time and available, you know, like I theoretically could, and I say no, which is a good thing because it's my boundaries and it's healthy and, you know, good thing, but it's still hard. Whereas if I am just so busy, I spend my time, I spend my energy on the things that I've chosen to spend it on, then they're probably not going to ask me in the first place because they're going to see that I don't have the ability to do it. But if they do, instead of having to say, no, I'm setting a reactive boundary, I can't do it because it's too much of you to ask for me or whatever. Instead, when I do say no, it's very easy because there's a very clear and reasonable, like, no, I can't because I'm doing this other thing. No, I can't because I already spent the money that you're asking to borrow on this other thing. And of course, again, like all these things, they're ideal states, right? It's not a thing that you actually do. I don't even think it's a thing that's actually possible, or if it is, it's not possible for more than a moment in a particular context. It's just we aim for it. We go that way. That in the past, when I've had I was going to say fortune, maybe privilege is a better word. I don't know. In the past, when I've worked at a place with a terrible boss and that boss is violating everybody's boundaries and asking people for things and whatever that they don't want to give, and they either have to say no and deal with all that or say yes, and the boss just doesn't ask me for those things, is in large part, I mean, of course, I got to acknowledge privilege, things that are outside of my control, but it always comes down to their perception of me is that it is not a good thing, not a good idea for them to ask me for something like that. How much of that is identity related things like being a 6'5" guy, you know, a man, male, presenting, whatever, you know, some element probably depends on the situation and the person. How much of that is because I fill my time and energy with things, particularly family, which by the way comes up all the time, right? That the people with young kids don't get asked to stay late as much as the people who don't have kids, right? Which again, not saying is fair. That's not the point of whether it's fair or not. The point is that the person asking people to stay late has a perception of who might be able to, who might be willing to, who it's appropriate to ask. So that's the idea of proactive boundaries. We want to get the good stuff in so that anything left over that is asked for, we're okay with. Whatever we're being asked to spend and spending is within our reactive boundaries, because that's all we have left is something that we're okay with giving away for whatever reason. Somebody give me something specific and practical. I feel like when I see trends, and I see them everywhere, because that's, everybody's brain, but I look for patterns. We all do it. I see trends and I want to talk to the trends, because I don't know what everybody's dealing with. So I might as well talk to the thing that seems to me to be kind of generally out there. And right now it is people who are depleted and have nothing to give, and who want help but can't get it because the people they would get help from are also depleted and have nothing to give. And then we get mad at each other instead of being mad at the situation, or being mad at the people who actually do theoretically have something to give and could help us but aren't, instead of each other. Generally speaking, again, all kinds of terrible relationships out there, but generally speaking, if you are in a good relationship with romantic, parent-child, platonic friends, roommates, whatever, if you're in a relationship by consent and the other person is too, generally speaking, you want to help each other. You want to be helpful to each other. You don't want to harm each other. So when it happens that you are harming each other, or you are not being helpful to each other, it's much more likely that that's because you've reached the limits of your abilities than it is because you just don't care. But we talk to each other like it's about caring. A very common example of this, I mentioned briefly before, is the "I'm sadder than you" competition that people get into, the oppression Olympics or whatever, that we're now arguing about which of us has it worse, rather than talking about what are the things that are making it so that we both have it so bad and what we can do together. We're decreasing our ability to handle the situation by separating ourselves from each other instead of coming together against whatever the situation is. By the way, just to be clear, when this is happening, a really good sign that this is happening, and also a terrible thing that happens in this context, is when I don't have anything to give you, but I love you so much, I'm going to push, I'm going to try anyway, and I do something that I think is going to be helpful for you, and it actually turns out not to be helpful for you. Because now I made it even less sustainable. I pushed myself in some way, and maybe the thing that would actually help you is, that's a hard limit. I actually can't do that, but this thing that I did is something that I can do, but had to push myself and potentially injure myself to do, and then it doesn't help anyway. I'm going to feel even worse and probably be mad at you, rationally or not really, because I did all this to help you and now you're saying it's still just as bad as it was. Or if you actually overtly tell me that what I just did to try and help you, so if you don't notice it or comment on it at all, that's going to be bad for me. But if you do, and you say that it's not helpful, or even worse, you say that it's harmful what I did, pretty likely that I'm going to be furious with you, because I just did this thing for you. How dare you? And even if it's not helpful, you should still at least acknowledge what I just went through for you. And instead you're telling me I'm not helping when I'm doing everything I can in this position and harming myself to be helpful, because that's how much I care, and you just don't care. And it gets bad. If you're having arguments like that, there's a good chance that you're just in a place where both of you, or all three or four, or how many there are of you, that none of you have it to be able to give each other what you want, or to help each other, or whatever. I understand, because I have the same temptation right now. I want to say, unless, or except, or you could do this one thing. There's still, we always want to find something, some unthought of, some specific, this thing is the secret. This is the key. You got to change how you think about it, and what. Sure, except again, sometimes you can't change how you think about it. You got to change the situation. Yeah. Except sometimes you can't. You got to change how you perceive the situation. Yeah, except sometimes you can't. You got to stop being aware of it. Yeah, except sometimes you can't. This is not a very hopeful message. I think it is. I imagine it doesn't come. I imagine it comes across as bleak. But to me, at least, if I look at it this way, maybe it doesn't enable me to resolve the situation because it's still a hard limit. But at least I'm not adding on top of what I'm dealing with the extra piece of feeling bad because I should be doing more or could be doing more. At least I can say, like, no, I have actually done everything that I can do. Still no specific comments from anybody. That's okay. I'll say this, we got 10 minutes or so left. So here's a specific thing that's more actionable that can help prevent getting to this kind of place. Maybe that's what I should have focused on instead of, I don't know, I just feel like so many people are in this place that talking about how to prevent it sometimes just makes it worse because it's saying, well, okay, great, I should have done that, I could have done that, so it really is my fault that I'm here. And no. Actually, let's talk about that real quick. The idea of mistakes, that I made a mistake. So it is good, it is important, it's helpful, it's useful to be able to look back at the past and say, well, this thing that happened that I didn't like, what did I do in connection with that, before that, near that, what caused that, whatever. It's good to look at those things and say, okay, yeah, now if I had known how it was going to play out, I wouldn't have done that, I would have done it this other way. That's good. We should do it all the time, as much as we can, spare the resources to do it. But often that gets connected to this other thing of, and therefore I'm a bad person for not having done it that way. Instead of, oh, if I had known how it was going to go, I would have done it this other way. It's, I should have known how it was going to go, and I should have done it this other way, meaning that I failed by not doing it, which makes sense sometimes, I guess, but it's generally not useful because, like I just said, it's helpful to look at past mistakes. What I call a mistake, what I consider a mistake is I did something thinking it would lead to a certain outcome, and it actually led to a different outcome than I wanted. That's the mistake. It doesn't make me a bad person for having done it, right? Now, this isn't to absolve people like, oh, everybody's a good person. It's more just, again, we're focusing on utility. So it's not about being a good person or a bad person, but thinking of yourself as a bad person is generally not a very useful thing. Of course, thinking of yourself as a good person is also not often a useful thing, which is why I kind of throw those concepts out. Not that they're not useful or that they don't exist or anything. They're just not typically that useful in changing things to make it more like what you want it to be. Because if I think that way, then that makes it more costly and therefore disincentivizes me from going back and exploring my mistakes and figuring out what I could do differently next time. What's worth trying next, right? If anytime I look back at a mistake, again, for me, just something I did thinking it would lead to one outcome, but it led to a different outcome. If I look back at that and say, oh, damn it, I screwed it up again, then I'm not going to do that very often. If I look at it and say, oh, good, okay, now I know, I got something out of that, then I might do it a lot more frequently. So just putting that context out there, because if we're going to talk a little bit, which it seems useful to do, about what things you can do to try and hold off this state for as long as possible, or prevent it or avoid it, or get help when you're still able to get help before you get there, we got to acknowledge that it's okay to say, oh, here's this thing I could have done that might have helped, and it is not reasonable, it was not possible for me to have known to do that thing at that time. That only makes sense given information that I didn't have then, that I have now. So I'm not mad at my past self, I just didn't have the information I needed or the resources I needed, but now I do, so let's evaluate it. So some ways to kind of see this coming and avoid it, right? Number one, the easiest and biggest red flag is when you start approaching or passing your soft limits, right? That must happen before you get to your hard limits. And again, sometimes this happens in a moment. There's not actually any time between I'm at baseline or sustainable, and then I start building up and building up. But sometimes there's time. So if you feel more tired one day than you did the previous day, then the previous day wasn't sustainable. If that repeats and the next day you're even more tired than you were on that day, then something unsustainable happened on both days. And now you can start looking at, okay, what's in common of those days? and on a third day and a fourth day and so on. Every day that you feel worse than the previous day, it doesn't mean it's inevitable that it will continue to go that way, which is another trap that people fall into is, ooh, each day has been worse than the previous day for the last 4. Now I'm starting to predict that tomorrow will be worse and the next day will be worse. And there's no point in life and this is all terrible. Again, there can be reasonable, good, rational, logical reasons to think that that is true. It just tends not to be useful unless we use it like we're talking about now. Say, okay, this is unsustainable. It's going in a bad direction. So let me start looking at what is happening. What was I doing or what was occurring around me or in my vicinity or what was I aware of on that first day that it got worse the next day that I wasn't doing or aware of or whatever previously. In other words, rather than asking what's causing it, why is this happening? Ask what else is happening nearby, whether that's nearby in time or space or whatever. I don't want to explore why am I feeling how I'm feeling. I want to explore what else is happening as I'm feeling. And then I can start to experiment with those as correlations. Well, this thing keeps happening at around the same time that I feel this way. Maybe those two things are related. Let me check it out. Let me address something, like change something so that the thing is different. And then let me see if the way I feel is different. And if so, okay, there's something there. And if not, well, maybe it's still worth doing if it was easy or better or whatever. Maybe not. Maybe I throw it away completely. Either way, I want to go look at something else. So as soon as you start to feel those soft limits approaching, think of it in those terms. But here's a really big, really good red flag. And again, I'll never say something is like 100%. I guess that was a paradoxical statement. I'll never say something was 100%, but you get the point. Generally speaking, if you are feeling, what's the word I want to use here? If there's something that you are not doing, here's the way to phrase it. If you feel like you're failing, then it's probably not an issue of willingness. If it's something that I could easily do and am not doing by choice, like not theoretically could do, but could actually literally do in the context in which I am, blah, 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 and choose not to do it because I think it has a negative value, then I don't tend to feel like a failure there. I might feel like other people think of me as a failure and have issues that, or I might think about what particular outcomes that has, and even though there's good ones and that's why I don't want to do it, there's other bad ones and I regret those. Well, that's fair too. But if I'm feeling like I'm such a failure, I'm such a burden, I'm letting everybody down, I only make things worse, then the issue is not your willingness. Your issue is not how much you would push yourself. It's that you're hitting limits. When we don't do things because we don't want to do them, or not even because, when we don't do things that we don't want to do, we don't feel bad about not doing them. We might feel bad about other things that are connected to that, but not just the act of not doing it. But we feel bad about not doing something, or about doing something that we're trying not to do, right? When we feel bad about that, it's almost always going to be a sign that we've hit some limits. So just keep that in mind, and there's more to say, but I gotta go. Thank you for being here. Be kind and generous to yourselves and to others, but you can't really be very kind and generous to others if you don't do it to yourself first. Yeah, valid in the chat, but I'm not gonna call it out right now because we gotta wrap up, and that's a big thing to bring up all at the end. But yeah, connection, not isolation, et cetera, et cetera. I appreciate you all being here. I enjoy being here, and I'll be here next week, and the next week, and the next week, and the next week. So be well, and I will see you all back here next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Central Time. Thank you.